Chapter 3 of Byways to Blessedness by James Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Chapter 3. Transcending Difficulties and Perplexities. Man who man would be must rule the empire of himself. In it must be supreme, establishing his throne on vanquished will, quelling the anarchy of hopes and fears, being himself alone. Shelley. Have you missed your aim? Well, the mark is still shining. Did you faint in the race? Well, take breath for the next. Ella Wheeler Wilcox. To suggest that any degree of blessedness may be extracted from difficulties and perplexities will doubtless appear absurd to many, but truth is ever paradoxical, and the curses of the foolish are the blessings of the wise. Difficulties arise in ignorance and weakness, and they call for the attainment of knowledge and the acquisition of strength. As understanding is acquired by right living, difficulties become fewer, and perplexities gradually fade away, like the perishable mists which they are. Your difficulty is not contained primarily in the situation which gave rise to it, but in the mental state with which you regard that situation, and which you bring to bear upon it. That which is difficult to a child presents no difficulty to the matured mind of the man, and that which to the mind of an unintelligent man is surrounded with perplexity would afford no ground for perplexity to an intelligent man. To the untutored and undeveloped mind of the child how great, and apparently insurmountable, appear the difficulties which are involved in the learning of some simple lesson. How many anxious and laborious hours and days, or even months, its solution costs, and frequently how many tears are shed in hopeless contemplation of the unmastered, and apparently insurmountable, wall of difficulty. Yet the difficulty is in the ignorance of the child only, and its conquest and solution is absolutely necessary for the development of intelligence and for the ultimate welfare, happiness, and usefulness of the child. Even so it is with difficulties of life with which older children are confronted, and which it is imperative, for their own growth and development, that they should solve and surmount, and each difficulty solved means so much more experience gained, so much more insight and wisdom acquired. It means a valuable lesson learned, with the added gladness and freedom of a task successfully accomplished. What is the real nature of a difficulty? Is it not a situation which is not fully grasped and understood in all its bearings? As such, it calls for the development and exercise of a deeper insight and broader intelligence than has hitherto been exercised. It is an urgent necessity calling forth unused energy, and demanding the expression and employment of latent power in hidden resources. It is therefore a good angel, albeit disguised, a friend, a teacher, and when calmly listened to and rightly understood, leads to larger blessedness and higher wisdom. Without difficulties there could be no progress, no unfoldment, no evolution. Universal stagnation would prevail, and humanity would perish of ennui. Let a man rejoice when he is confronted with obstacles, for it means that he has reached the end of some particular line of indifference or folly, and is now called upon to summon up all his energy and intelligence in order to extricate himself, and to find a better way, that the powers within him are crying out for greater freedom, for enlarged exercise and scope. No situation can be difficult of itself. It is the lack of insight into its intricacies, and the want of wisdom in dealing with it, which give rise to the difficulty. Immeasurable, therefore, is the gain of a difficulty transcended. Difficulties do not spring into existence arbitrarily and accidentally. They have their causes, and they are called forth by the law of evolution itself, by the growing necessities of the man's being. Herein resides their blessedness. There are ways of conduct which end inevitably in complications and perplexities, and there are ways of conduct which lead, just as inevitably, out of troublesome complexities. Howsoever tightly a man may have bound himself round, he can always unbind himself. Into whatsoever morasses of trouble and trackless wastes of perplexity he may have ignorantly wandered, he can always find his way out again. He can always recover the lost highway of uninvolved simplicity, which leads, straight and clear, to the sunny city of wise and blessed action. But he will never do this by sitting down and weeping in despair, nor by complaining and worrying and aimlessly wishing he were differently situated. His dilemma calls for alertness, logical thought, and calm calculation. His position requires that he shall strongly command himself, that he shall think and search, and rouse himself to strenuous and unremitting exertion in order to regain himself. Worry and anxiety only serve to heighten the gloom and exaggerate the magnitude of the difficulty. If he will but quietly take himself to task, and retrace, in thought, the more or less intricate way by which he has come to his present position, he will soon perceive where he made mistakes, will discover those places where he took a false turn, and where a little more thoughtfulness, judgment, economy, or self-denial would have saved him. He will see how, step by step, he has involved himself, and how a riper judgment and clearer wisdom would have enabled him to take an altogether different and truer course. Having proceeded thus far, and extracted from his past conduct this priceless grain of golden wisdom, his difficulty will have already assumed less impregnable proportions, and he will then be able to bring to bear upon it the searchlight of dispassionate thought, to thoroughly anatomize it, to comprehend it in all its details, and to perceive the relation with which those details bear to the motive source of action and conduct within himself. This being done, the difficulty will have ceased, for the straight way out of it will plainly appear, and the man will have thus learned, for all time, his lesson, will have gained an idea of wisdom and a measure of blessedness of which he can never again be deprived. Just as there are ways of ignorance, selfishness, folly, and blindness, which end in confusion and perplexity, so there are ways of knowledge, self-denial, wisdom, and insight, which lead to pleasant and peaceful consummations. He who knows this will meet difficulties in a courageous spirit, and in overcoming them will evolve truth out of error, bliss out of pain, and peace out of perturbation. No man can be confronted with a difficulty which he has not the strength to meet and subdue. Worry is not merely useless, it is a folly, for it defeats that power and intelligence which is otherwise equal to the task. Every difficulty can be overcome if rightly dealt with. Anxiety is therefore unnecessary. The task which cannot be overcome ceases to be a difficulty and become an impossibility, and anxiety is still unnecessary, for there is only one way of dealing with an impossibility, namely to submit to it. The inevitable is the best. Heartily know, where half gods go, the gods arrive. And just as domestic, social, and economic difficulties are born of ignorance and lead to riper knowledge, so every religious doubt, every mental perplexity, every heart-beclouding shadow, presages greater spiritual gain, is prophetic of a brighter dawn of intelligence for him on whom it falls. It is a great day in the life of a man, though at the time he knows it not, when bewildering perplexities concerning the mystery of life take possession of his mind, for it signifies that his era of dead indifference, of animal sloth, of mere vegetative happiness has come to an end, and that henceforth he is to live as an inspiring, self-evolving being. No longer a mere human animal, he will now begin to live as a man, exerting all his mental energies to the solution of life's problems, to the answering of those haunting perplexities which are the sentinels of truth, and which stand at the gate and threshold of the temple of wisdom. He it is who, when great trials come, nor seeks nor shuns them, but doth calmly stay. Nor will he ever rest again in selfless ease and listless ignorance, nor sleekly sate himself upon the swine's husks of fleshly pleasures, nor find a hiding place from the ceaseless whisperings of his heart's dark and indefinable interrogatories. The divine within him has awakened. A sleeping God is shaking off the incoherent visions of the night, never again to slumber, never again to rest until his eyes rest upon the full, broad day of truth. It is impossible for such a man to hush, for any length of time, the call to his higher purposes and achievements, which are aroused within him, for the awakened faculties of his being will ceaselessly urge him on to the unraveling of his perplexities. For him there is no peace in sin, no more rest in error, no final refuge, but in wisdom. Great will be the blessedness of such a man, when conscious of the ignorance of which his doubts and perplexities are born, and acknowledging and understanding that ignorance, not striving to hide himself from it, he earnestly applies himself to its removal, seeks unremittingly, day after day, for that pathway of light, which shall enable him to dispel all dark shadows, dissolve all his doubts, and find the solution to all his pressing problems. And as a child is glad when it has mastered a lesson long toiled over, just so a man's heart becomes light and free when he has satisfactorily met some worldly difficulty. Even so, but to a far greater degree, is the heart of a man rendered joyous and peaceful when some vital and eternal question, which has been long brooded over and grappled with, is at last completely answered, and its darkness is forever dispelled. Do not regard your difficulties and perplexities as portentous of ill. By doing so you will make them ill, but regard them as prophetic of good, which indeed they are. Do not persuade yourself that you can evade them. You cannot. Do not try to run from them. This is impossible, for wherever you go they will still be there with you. But meet them calmly and bravely. Confront them with all the dispassion and dignity which you can command. Weigh up their proportions, analyze them, grasp their details, measure their strength, understand them, attack them, and finally vanquish them. Thus will you develop strength and intelligence. Thus will you enter into one of those byways of blessedness which are hidden from the superficial gaze. End of chapter 3. Recording by Andrea Fiore.